Good morning. My name is Emma Blessing. I'm the Visitor Services Coordinator at Atlanta Contemporary. We are an Atlanta-based nonprofit arts organization with galleries. We have a studios program. We do a lot of events. And we're actually free admission, one of the only free admission art galleries in Atlanta. So I'll go ahead and introduce Joey and Chris from Discrit. These guys have been working with us for a while to present kind of college level arts and culture discussions. It's always great to have them. And this is the third virtual event, I think, that we've done with them, third or fourth. So welcome back. I'm gonna pass the baton over to Joey. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma, for the nice introduction. And thank you all to all our new participants joining us from pretty much, I'm assuming, all over the country. My name is Joey Molina, they, he, and I'm a multidisciplinary artist and scholar that engages with visual culture of all mediums. My background is in film video from Georgia State University. For the past couple of years, I've worked independently in producing several screening series. Ultimately, that led me to collaborate on Discrit with Chris. Discrit is an art education platform promoting experimental thinking and debate in contemporary art and culture. We've been programming events at Atlanta Contemporary since the fall of 2018. We welcome you to today's event, which is sponsored by an IDEA Capital Grant. They are based in Atlanta, and we highly encourage anyone seeking funds for projects to apply. I don't want to take up too much time as I'm super excited to hear from today's guest lecturer, the phenomenal Legacy Russell. And a quick note about the Discrit platform. Discrit's platform, as well as the content we'll be talking about today. We acknowledge the need for insular conversations among people of like mind, background, and experience, especially when it comes to conversations around race and identity-based histories and systems of oppression. Today, we hope to create a space where divergent and diverse perspectives may come into conversation with one another in a space of mutual respect and, above all else, learning. The success of our goal lies partly with us as organizers, but also with you, our valued guests. We ask that everyone be open to and respectful of different styles of areas of knowledge, to embrace the discomfort of ideological difference and the reality that we're all on different parts of the path towards self-knowledge and justice. For some of us, Legacy's work may fuel bouts of self-doubt, self-examination, and a more critical eye toward our received histories. To us, this is a great and positive and vital thing. If we have failed to moderate and craft a space where divergent perspectives can come together in respectful debate and knowledge sharing, and you want to let us know, we ask that out of respect for our guest time and work, we make space for such conversations at another time. You're welcome to email Chris and I or DM us if you'd like to start a dialogue. And of course, we welcome your thoughts and feedback. So with all that said, I'll pass it on to Chris so he can introduce our guests.
Okay, hi everybody. As Joey mentioned, I'm Chris. I'm the other co-founder of Discrit. I'm also an MA candidate in the history of art at Williams College, allegedly starting this fall, but who really knows? It's my great honor and privilege to introduce Legacy Russell. Legacy Russell is a curator, writer, and artist born and raised in New York City. She is the associate curator of exhibitions at the Studio Museum in Harlem. Recent exhibitions include Michael Armitage at Projects 110, organized with Thelma Golden and the Studio Museum in Harlem at MoMA in 2019. Dozie Kanu Function in 2019. Radical Reading Room 2019 at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And Mood, Studio Museum Artist in Residence 2018 to 2019 at MoMA PS1. That last one was also in 2019. Russell's ongoing academic work and research focuses on gender, performance, digital selfdom, internet idolatry, and new media ritual. She is the recipient of the Tama Foundation 2019 Arts Writing Award in Digital Art and a 2020 Rauschenberg Residency Fellow. Her first book, Glitch Feminism, is forthcoming from Verso Books in fall 2020. So without further ado, I'd love to turn it over to Legacy.
Thank you all. Emma, Chris, Joey, Atlanta Contemporary, Discrit. I am going to start with a screening of this video essay. Typically in the history of how I work, I create video essays as a way of kind of extrapolating certain lines of thought. So we're going to begin with the screening. It's about 20 minutes, and then we'll go from there into the talk and the conversation. So we're going to start in 2004 today, because 2004 was a memorable year. It was the year that I graduated from high school. I turned 21. I left New York to live in St. Paul, Minnesota. It was my first year of college, and it was the year that the social networking service that would become known as Facebook first launched, first at Harvard and then reaching across the United States, eventually making its way to my dorm room in the Midwest. It was also the year that, unimaginable now, but incumbent Republican President George W. Bush defeated Democratic nominee John Kerry, a young United States senator from Massachusetts. And remarkably, it was the year that Keenen Ivory Wayans directed the American movie White Chicks, a movie starring two members of his own family, his brothers Sean Wayne and Marlon Wayans. The plot of the movie in a snapshot for those who have not seen it. Two Black FBI agents, brothers Kevin and Marcus Copeland, botch a drug bust and are at risk of losing their jobs as a result. The agents are thrown a bone of mercy by their miffed supervisor, who tells them that if they're able to successfully accompany two white socialites, Brittany and Tiffany Wilson, the sort of Paris Hilton adjacent vibe, as their chauffeurs and bodyguards for a weekend in the Hamptons at a luxury fashion event, that they will be redeemed and can maintain their jobs. There's been a spate of celebrity kidnappings, and the Copeland brothers' presence is intended to keep the Wilson sisters safe. En route to the event, however, the Wilson sisters get into a car accident, which results in some injuries, superficial cuts and scratches on their faces. And given their superficial personalities, the incident prompts the sisters to refuse to make the trip to the Hamptons because they just don't want to put their reputations on the line. But with their jobs on the line, the Copeland brothers convince the Wilson socialite sisters to stay in a hotel, hide out for a few days, and heal. The two Black agents then dress up as the white sisters, and in disguise, they attend the fashion event in their place. I begin here because White Chicks, as a movie, is founded on what is presupposed to be an absurd premise, that two full-grown Black men could ever possibly pass as two socialite white women, a transmission of whiteness that is understood to defy plausibility. Given this framework, Richard Roeper, of film critic Ebert and Roeper fame, kept his review pithy. It's the worst movie of the year. With a running time of 109 minutes, the entire movie hinges its comedic delivery on the fact that two Black people, Black men to boot, would not only have the audacity to perform whiteness, but that the performance in white drag could be so convincing that with it would come a social and cultural ascendancy that we might assume the Copeland brothers, despite their agent credentials, would otherwise be denied. The impossibility of this is so immense that every scene as it unfolds only deepens the absurdity, offending the foundational logic of race in America and triggering the power of representation and visibility therein. Despite the bad reviews and audacious framework, White Chicks still brazenly offers up some truths about the dynamics of race and gender in America and the ordinary violence that comes with the embodied privilege of a cisgendered whiteness. In a scene where the two Copeland brother FBI agents, disguised as the Wilson sisters, first arrive in the Hamptons, they realize that they are checking in, that they have the wrong credit cards and identification. These cards don't correspond with their identities. So later in a subsequent scene, the Copeland brothers, still in disguise with their Blackness undetected, are cruising in a car with a gaggle of white girlfriends who, on hearing Vanessa Carlton's pop song 1,000 Miles on the radio, all begin to sing along. The code switching there is so confusing every time I watch that. But these events, right, in this movie capture sort of with an adroit accuracy the trope of white supremacy as it performs and postures both in public and private space. The banal nature of these scenes are made all the more violent by being so quotidian. The Copeland brothers in their disguise experiencing for the first time the freedoms of a white embodiment. Watching it now, 16 years later, I have to wonder if characters like White Chicks, Copeland brothers, FBI agents, dressed up as the socialite Wilson sisters, were they in fact real and out in the world, could have maintained this performance, or perhaps even bolstered it, had they come of age in the age of social media. As Danity Kane girl group star Don Richards said of Instagram filters in a 2013 tweet, filters are the new bleach. In 2018, 19-year-old Swedish model and Instagram star Emma Hallberg gained attention alongside other Instagram influencers enacting much of the same for sharing photos of herself with her over 260,000 followers in what appeared to be blackface. Writer Juana Thompson, after tweeting on the topic of, quote, white girls cosplaying as Black women on Instagram, unquote, wrote a piece that year for Paper Magazine titled How White Women on Instagram Are Profiting Off Black Women, in which she further interrogates the phenomenon of blackfishing. Blackfishing, for those of you who are new to the term, is when non-Black, often white people, pretend to be Black on social media, utilizing a combination of makeup, prosthetics, and even surgery to amplify this performance. I do not see myself as anything other than white, Hallberg told BuzzFeed in her defense. I get a deep tan naturally from the sun. Writer Doreen St. Felix says it best in her 2014 tweet. Everybody want to be a Black woman, but nobody want to be a Black woman. Juana Thompson's tweet and subsequent article came nearly a year after writer Lauren Michelle Jackson penned a 2017 op-ed for Teen Vogue. In her piece, We Need to Talk About Digital Blackface and Reaction GIFs, Jackson defines digital blackface as a type of minstrel performance in cyberspace. Jackson had first written on the topic in 2014 in a piece for The Owl, wherein she wondered, what is the half-life of a meme? What is the rate at which a good-natured meme decays into the grossest displays of public ridicule? The viral circulation of the Black body in the form of reaction GIFs, Drake caught in an eternal shoulder shake as he dances silently to his 2016 song Hotline Bling, actress Viola Davis as How to Get Away with Murder's Annalise Keating taking off her wig and makeup, Scandal's Kerry Washington, who we see here as the fixer character, Olivia Pope sipping Riley from her wine glass. These all live as an archive of Black performativity. The platform Giphy, a monument to Black movement and performance, a living theater of actions on eternal silent loop, dutifully performing for an audience of 1 or 1 million. Black reaction GIFs allow for containment of Black affect, one that performs and circulates without permission of or payment to whomever is depicted within them. Fordist in their production and mass consumption, this digital material disembodies the Black body from having a breathing selfhood that makes the Blackness within it a caricature, a cartoon. Blackfishing and digital blackface go hand in hand, though. Each bend to the other. The presence of this dual phenomena is one that gestures towards the enduring legacy of minstrel shows, a theatrical tradition of blackface that finds its roots in as early as the 19th century. Whether it's Emma Hallberg or Rachel Dolezal doing it with the embodiment of Blackness, there is an amplification of presence, circulation, and consumption. A self blackened in body or affect, be it blackfishing or in digital blackface, is one for capture. A body that, when donned, gives the wearer the permission to perform, where performance itself becomes a mandatory becoming, even when the body becoming is not actually Black. Thus, I'm going to argue today that Blackness in its very self is memetic, and by extension, the technology of memes is a core component of a dawning digital culture, which has been driven by, shaped by, authored by Blackness.
Check out this sweater. Luxury fashion house Gucci is apologizing after getting backlash for it on social media. Some folks have said that the sweater's design resembles blackface. Well, the top is no longer available on the company's website.
The transmission of materials such as reaction GIFs and images of Instagram influencers painted head to toe in Black skin demonstrates that the complicated power drawn from and troubling racialized agenda triggered by the performance of Black embodiment is complicated indeed. Regardless, it's very clear, digital culture as it stands would not exist without us. Black Meme, as part of my ongoing research, identifies 21 points across history, all of which you saw just now in the video essay, beginning in the 1900s and traveling through to the 21st century, that have paved the way for the notion of the meme as we understand it, and set the stage for the construct of digital virality. For the sake of today's talk, I'm only going to go into a selection of them, giving us some time to collectively think through their history and impact. Meme is an abbreviated form of the Greek word mememi, which means something imitated. Here today, we define Black meme through the notion of transmission by way of imitation. Quite literally, the copying and transmission of Blackness as memetic material, buoyed forth by modern media and the engine of visual culture. Predating the 1900s, one could argue that the first Black memes were actually those transmitted by the Middle Passage, that the transfer of the Black meme as a material comes down to the movement of Black data as carried by Black people, carried first in the form of our physical bodies, the genesis point for a sort of rhizomatic splitting off that occurred thereafter, wherein Black speech, gesture, vernacular, movement, embodiment, all was co-opted as part of the violent project of American capitalism and slavery. Recognizing here the ever-present relationship in contemporary visual culture between memetic Blackness and the fetishization of Black affect, and through this, also too, the exploitation and virality of Black pain, we will begin in the 20th century for now and actively, deliberately refuse this paradigm. We will begin today with an act of Black love, a kiss. In particular, we're going to begin with this kiss, which is a meaningful one. It's one between Bahamian American performer and recording artist Burt Williams and performer and Harlem entrepreneur Odessa Warren Gray that takes place at the end of the 1913 American black and white silent film, Lime Kiln Field Day. The story of memetic Blackness cannot be told without including discussion of this film, which is widely reputed to be the oldest surviving film featuring Black actors, and therefore a right beginning as we consider this material as one of the first ever Black memes. Black love will carry us as we start today. The kiss between Williams and Gray at the conclusion of this film is a rare moment of intimacy between two Black actors, deeply unusual for this period of time. The rushes from the film's shooting were found in 1939 by MoMA's first film curator, Iris Berry, amongst a larger institutional acquisition of 900 negatives from the trailblazing Bronx-based Biograph studio in the wake of the closure of the studio's facilities. In the 1970s, the rushes were transferred to Safety Film Stock, and in the 1980s, the MoMA began the process of restoration. In 2004, MoMA film curator Ron Magliazzi began putting together the various components of the restored material. Years later, Magliazzi spoke about Lime Kiln Field Day saying, quote, "I would like it to go viral." Magliozzi imagines the future of this film footage, explaining, "We would like to give it back to the community, the Black artists. I had a vision of giving it to important Black artists and having them edit it, sample from it, and do whatever they want to it." Here, Magliazzi brilliantly draws us in to the conflicting tensions of, on the one hand, a sort of fantasy of cultural reparations, a giving of privatized, institutionalized, archival material back to a Black creative community, and on the other hand, deploying the language of meme culture in a hope for the eventual virality of an early record of Black embodiment. With Lime Kiln Field Day owned by the MoMA and under the custodial care of a curatorial team, this dream of virality is one that does little to resist the American tradition of gatekeepers controlling the transmission of cultural production, establishing themselves as the ones who would or should decide, and in turn who should or should not be canonized as an important Black artist. In this way, though, Magliazzi bends history, bringing the labor of an early record of Black embodiment, a genesis story of Black movement, affect, intimacy, collaboration within Black visual culture, to meet the very fractal and rhizomatic transmission of this material through a memetic vehicle that within a contemporary framework complicates the authenticity of the material's agency itself. Running alongside this epic kiss of Williams and Gray in Lime Kiln Field Day, we also should explore the cultural and social text of D.W. Griffith's 1915 silent epic film, The Birth of a Nation. This was a dramatization of the history of the Civil War in America, with its juxtaposition of words and images and a staging of a toxic transmutation of viral Blackness as the structural foundation for the memetic gift as we know it today. Griffith's film was post-truth, or as Hannah Arendt might have called it, a form of defactualization, before the term became popular as we now use it. The work itself advances virulently racist agendas at the early birth of American cinema. Griffith's film, directed during his time at Biograph Studio, the same studio that produced Limekiln Field Day just 2 years earlier, and whose dissolution in 1915 was prompted by Griffith's departure, demonstrating his industry-holding power during this prominent period, is a key example of both the transmission of a counterfactual representation of Black movement and gesture, made minstrel in its racist performance of white actors in blackface, as well as the strategic application of a minstrel Black embodiment as a tool of political propaganda. Film critic Richard Brody writes, "It's the kinetic model for a century of action scenes." The original sin of American cinema, Birth of a Nation, introduced the use of dramatic close-ups, tracking shots, and other expressive camera movements, parallel action sequences, cross-cutting, and other editing techniques, which established a precedent for today's widely circulated reaction GIFs that regularly feature Black performers, so much so that Black reaction GIFs is actually a searchable category in and of itself on the GIF search engine, Giphy. In a twist of fate, the failure of the original copyright holder to renew this film's copyright resulted in it falling into the public domain. This meant that anyone could duplicate and sell copies of this film, amplifying its virality. In 2015, critic and Time editor Richard Corliss wrote for Time magazine, "Griffith's film is estimated to have earned $18 million in its few years." Those first few years made the astounding equivalent of $1.8 billion today. In current dollars, only Avatar and Titanic have earned more money worldwide. Foundationally, memetic blackness and the archetype of the Black meme could not have been possible without the devastating American history of lynching photography, which engineered the practice of producing and circulating postcards depicting the lynching of Black bodies, and often the spectator spectacle that was in attendance to witness and celebrate it. Photographs of this variety made it possible to travel this genre of terrorism across states, and to enter into international circulation as well, a form of reportage and an active flex on behalf of white supremacy. An alternate original sin within this timeline, time-stamped in its birth before the birth of a nation, this type of circulated media, souvenirs of hate crimes, entered into cultural consciousness and shaped the bedrock of American visual culture and the notion of memetic or viral imagery. Often accompanied by a poem or a line of text, the lynching postcard was itself a nascent form of moving image. Black images that move with a designated selection of words via manual transmission, as they were quite literally bought and sold, sent and received in the latter part of the 19th century. The distribution of matter of a character tending to incite arson, murder, or assassination through the United States mail was banned in 1908 as an amendment to the 1873 Comstock Act, which brought the inflammatory text and images of lynching postcards under some increased scrutiny. Still, lynching postcards continued in their circulation via mail and other channels well throughout the 20th century as the practice of lynching continued across America. In an age of the internet, these postcards remain collector's items for some and have entered an online memorabilia marketplace, reflected in the myriad of rare lynching photo postcards up for auction on websites like eBay, categorized as collectible Black Americana. The irony of this cannot be overlooked. Images of Black bodies for auction, over 150 years after the abolishment of slavery. The heraldic legacy and fetishization of Black death as meme, the memetic transmission of both social death and bodily death, both triggers to a more durational epigenetic trauma for Black people, continues to reverberate. Reaching backwards to reach forward, Black meme will travel from 1908 to 1983, to the release of Michael Jackson's legendary music video Thriller, and then from 1983 to 1991, to the televised footage of the beating of Rodney King at the hands of the LAPD. Jackson's Thriller and the footage of King each respectively became media sensations, setting the stage for what we now might recognize as the viral video. So we'll start with Michael Jackson. The debut of Michael Jackson's Thriller music video in 1983 is an important moment in this history. Released into the world to international acclaim and excitement, the video was practically played on loop on MTV. Launched after the Thriller album, Thriller doubled the sales of the actual album itself, making it the best-selling album in history, with 1 million copies sold on VHS. Even years later, I remember getting my own copy in the 90s and playing it at home to the point where my parents decided to hide it from me. So the Thriller music video changed completely how we understand moving image and performance at this time, transforming music videos themselves from a sort of unintellectual visual candy into something that could be taken seriously as a cinematic art form. Breaking down racial and cultural barriers as an international sensation, Thriller established that Black viral media could be self-determined and directed, extended in duration, narrative in form, and transcend the limitation of language, space, or time. Something to note here, which feels important to underscore given the question of transmission being posed here and the inherent power dynamics bound up within that process of making material move via memetic means, is that Epic Records, who represented Jackson at the time, chose to give the video away for free. Seeing the video as a marketing opportunity for the album, Epic Records used the video to leverage the album's content, sharing it globally to those they hoped would broadcast it. Still in sales, Epic shipped 1 million copies a week. By the end of 1984, the album had sold 33 million copies in the US. Since then, Thriller has remained unchallenged as the #1 album of all time. The acclaim and virality of Jackson's Thriller feels to me, however, like a shallow read of what this video really meant and what it did in this moment in time. Though, of course, we can't assume, nor should we overlay Jackson's creative and commercial intentions in the production of this video, it seems key to look backward at this moment in 1983 and read Thriller as a cultural, political, and social text in and of itself. Thriller was not released into a vacuum. It was released into a moment in history where a lot was taking place in the world. Thus, a read of this material, made intersectional with the historical narrative, feels useful given the framework of Black meme. It was in October of 1982 that President Ronald Reagan declared a war on drugs, reanimating the words of Richard Nixon, who in '72 had called for a national emergency, declaring that drugs were public enemy #1. The words of Reagan echoed Nixon, but Nixon's words were borrowed from those of his predecessor, Lyndon B. Johnson, who declared a war on poverty during his '64 State of the Union address. The war on drugs and poverty were dog whistle terms at best. The policies that rose up out of this period were violently punitive, giving cause for increased surveillance and profiling of Black and brown people across the United States, and with extreme sentencing disparities, setting the stage for a rapid rise in incarceration with a burgeoning for-profit prison industry. In the 1980s, while the number of arrests for all crimes had risen by 28%, the number of arrests for drug offenses rose 126%. Journalist Michael A. Gonzalez reflects on this period of time in his 2014 essay for Ebony magazine, saying, "The era of the 1980s turned thousands into zombies." It was also in 1982, just a year before the release of Thriller, that the Center for Disease Control first used the term AIDS to describe the virus. This moment in history is significant because the entire world was in a nascent stages of coming to an understanding about what AIDS was and how it was transmitted. Exploited within the media on a constant engine of fear-mongering and misinformation, this period triggered within a cultural consciousness pathologized fantasies and fears of an apocalyptic futurity, one where the world falls into the grip of a global contagion driven by queer people, poor people, and people of color. An academic paper written by neuropathologist W.R. Greenfield in the 1980s was sensationally, devastatingly, exploitatively titled Night of the Living Dead 2, and inquired in its abstract, do necromantic zombies transmit HTLV3 LAV during voodooistic rituals? Thus, the language of race, sexuality, and class in the moment where Jackson's Thriller first stepped onto a global stage was all bound up within the language of zombieism. The myth of the zombie first surfaced in Haiti in the 17th and 18th centuries. At the time, Haiti was known as Saint-Domingue and was under the ruling hand of France, deeply implicated in the transport of African slaves to perform labor on sugar plantations. Within the industrial complex of slavery as a capitalist institution, the Haitian model of zombie took two forms. One, where the individual, broken and made docile and servile, is stripped of agency or autonomy and becomes a machine of production, wherein the loss of will transforms the individual into a zombified figure, one with a body but without a soul. And two, the alternate version, more empowered as the revolutionary slave who in mutiny defeats their masters and so, unbroken, keeps their soul intact, but perhaps loses their body along the way. Zombies in a constant state of transmission, transformation, transmutation, and becoming are the embodiment of a memetic blackness. To have a zombie music video like Thriller, where undead, blackened bodies are reanimated, empowered, collectivized, enter into the bloodstream of popular culture in 1983, is therefore nothing short of explosive within a broader historical context when peered at in hindsight through this lens. Zombies represented America's greatest fears, and here is Jackson with Thriller embodying the trope in a way that had never been seen before. The video itself a contagion that, in its transmission, transformed the visibility of Black movement and created new vernacular within it. Switching gears, the contemporary circulation of memetic material supporting the supremacy of Black social death in the media as responsive to the ending of Black life, like phenomena as we saw in the video essay Trayvoning, where a person poses face down on the ground with a bag of Skittles and an Arizona iced tea, and a photograph is taken and shared on social media, is something that allows us to think through what the public response and discourse was in the moment of the murder of Trayvon Martin at the hand of George Zimmerman in 2012, and harkens back to the early virality of lynching postcards. The viral transmission of Black trauma online today, embodied by Diamond Reynolds' devastating Facebook photo showing Minnesota police shooting her partner Philando Castile, which, when shared initially, was shared over 32,000 times and generated over 1 million views, remains an urgent historical counterpoint to the August 1955 murder of 14-year-old Black teenager Emmett Till and Jet Magazine's September coverage of Till and his family that same year. Jet's feature on Till shared with the world, and firstly, namely, the Black readership of Jet, an African-American print publication founded in 1951, an image of Till mutilated beyond recognition. The public viewership and engagement of this image is cited as a formative moment of national consciousness raising, marking for many the beginning of the civil rights movement. What still images did for Till, for the American nation in 1955 in galvanizing action towards social justice. In 1991, a videotape of construction worker Rodney King being beaten at the hands of the LAPD made visible to many for the first time across the country police brutality, part of the legacy of a post-bellum body of American law enforcement abusing power in its perpetuation of social death against Black people with tactics of surveillance, harassment, coercion, and the exercising of control via physical violence. On March 3rd, 1991, a white man named George Holliday, the general manager of a plumbing supply company, stepped out onto the balcony of his Los Angeles apartment and with a Sony Handycam, a small handheld HD camcorder, filmed 4 LAPD officers swarming King. King had been pursued and pulled over by the police, instructed to exit his car, and told to lie on the ground. Holliday captured what ensued thereafter in 12 minutes of footage, 90 seconds of which would go on to become known as the Rodney King tape. The tape was sold by Holliday for $500 to the local news station KTLA. To put this transaction into better perspective, Abraham Zapruder, who in 1963 captured the moment John F. Kennedy was killed on his Bell and Howell Zomatic, sold the Kennedy tape exclusively to Life magazine for $100,000, which was the equivalent of $1 million at that time. So this sold for $500, and the video traveled as the Rodney King tape, which it became to be known as, across the country and then around the world, often with little credit to its producer. The message in this is devastating. Black life in precarity, a gross commodity for sale, sells cheap, and travels fast. Holliday's lawyer, James F. Jordan, called the tape the most played video in the history of this country. Jordan worked on behalf of Holliday to file copyright infringement lawsuits against news stations and television networks that aired the video without compensating or crediting Holliday for his camera work. In reaction to the reality of being rendered invisible in the witnessing, documenting, and then further transmission of the video of King's beating, Holiday sought other ways to make a profit, exploiting his role as voyeur and happenstance citizen journalist in creating a VHS tape, which was titled "Shoot News and Make Money with Your Camcorder." George Holiday has since gone on to market himself as the producer of the first ever viral video, a barrage of very bizarre sort of posturing in terms of establishing himself as the author of this 90 seconds of tape, a ground zero in an era before the internet, paving the way for a future culture of free trade, memetic blackness as transmitted via YouTube, Facebook Live, Vine, TikTok, and more. Despite the footage of being captured of King's beating by Holiday, all 4 police officers would later be acquitted, launching Los Angeles into the 1992 riots and setting the stage for what would become known as King's memetic catchphrase, "Can we all just get along?" transmitted wildly via television and broadcast in May of that year. Though King was the victim of the LAPD attack, on March 3rd, 1993, the New York Times made sure to note that King was, quote, no stranger to trouble, observing that King had been represented in the trial by defense lawyers as, quote, a dangerous, almost superhumanly strong felon, sweating, grunting, violent, and impervious to pain. The entanglement of race, class, and gender is important to underscore when considering the precarity of Black life and how this is represented within a discussion of virality. Journalist John Elegant wrote in 2014 in the New York Times addressing the murder of 18-year-old Michael Brown at the hands of the police in Ferguson, Missouri, quote, Michael Brown, 18, due to be buried on Monday, was no angel. With public records and interviews with friends and family revealing both problems and promise in his young life. Elegant's devastating assessment of Brown as no angel makes plain the embedded bias and supremacy of a white imagination attempting to grapple with a Black individual's right to live. João Costa Vargas and Joy A. James, in their groundbreaking essay, Refusing Blackness as Victimization, Trayvon Martin and the Black Cyborgs, point out the problem of presumed innocence, noting that for Black people, within a supremacist democratic system, it functions as a probation period, thereby positioning Black bodies, Michael Brown's, Trayvon Martin's, Philando Castile's, Emmett Till's, as living on borrowed time, impossible time, wherein as soon as the presumed innocence is over, time as a sin-free, threat-free person ends. Vargas and James note that the impossible nature of time as mapped to a Black life is largely because this time is not linear. Observing that this lack of linearity makes the span of a Black life one that is not chronological with the freedom to operate in a temporality that assumes the structure of a straight line, genealogical time, but rather ontological, and that a Black life is conditioned by a being and becoming into Blackness, a selfhood that bends and accelerates time, creating social and cultural reads of a Black childhood as adulthood, an act of reading that is deeply gendered in its own right, in addition to be racialized, and deeming a body in Black adulthood as somehow defying space and time, supernatural in its standing outside of logic, and even ultimately no longer worthy of life at all. Thus, strangely, the continuum of childhood as a construct that typically maps public empathy to a right to life is reversed entirely. Black children are read as Black adults, and so divorced from any site of origin within a broader psyche of supremacy, a form of social death in and of itself. And a Black individual who has made it to adulthood is read as an inherent threat that must be stopped, justifying the punishment of physical death, punishment for living. George Zimmerman, as part of his apology to the parents of Trayvon Martin, stated, I did not know how old he was. I thought he was a little bit younger than I am. Zimmerman at the time was 30 years old when he shot Martin. Martin was 17. To call on the incredible Christina Sharp, living in the wake, as in existing in a society that has been shaped, constituted, conditioned by the legacy of slavery in America, is a constant renegotiation that, as Sharp says, we Black people become the carriers of terror, terror's embodiment, and not the primary objects of terror's multiple enactments. The terrifying reading of the Black body in its life as inherently supernatural means conversely that a dead Black body is established as normative, which renders trends of memetic Blackness, like trayvoning, as purely play and performative, a replication of a standard way of being that in its echo signifies the mollification of terror's embodiment within a white imagination. If the right to a young Black life is read as counterfactual, then an undoing of this post-truth is advanced through gamifying Black death and reading living bodies as Black bodies through a cyborgian filter. To make play out of pain numbs the reality of physical violence through the physical performative act of an anti-Black reenactment. Trayvoning thereby becomes almost a form of Xeroxing, making copies of a copy so much so that at a certain point, the original image, so saturated in the transmissive act of imitation, is rendered invisible to its carriers, alien in its mutation. We see this phenomenon played out further in Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah's dystopian short story Zimmerland, wherein author Adjei-Brenyah imagines an entertainment park-style game, Zimmerland, that involves cosplay and participatory historical reenactment of the Trayvon Martin shooting. When a patron of the game playing the role of Zimmerman asks, "What is it that you're doing here?" the protagonist playing the role of Martin goes sharply off script, responding, "Living." It is the carrying of this living, the travel, transmission of Black life from its origin point via the act of memetic imitation that allows for Blackness to be worn by different players, as carried through and beyond a life on the internet. This extends to Black vernacular as well. Shifting focus, we travel now to 1990, when American documentary film Paris is Burning chronicled the competitions and community of ball culture in New York City in the 1980s and was released to critical acclaim. Directed by a white, cisgendered, genderqueer gay woman, Jenny Livingston, the creation of this film as an act in and of itself triggers some very real anxieties about the transmission of a radically queer Black and brown culture intended to push back against the gendered, socioeconomic, and racialized expectations of a mainstream capitalist culture becoming embedded within a memetic mainstream commercial transmission. Critiquing Livingston as a privileged white filmmaker, an outsider to ball culture, documenting Black and brown bodies, and in her doing so, opening queer private spaces as a site of white public voyeurism, Professor Bell Hooks wrote in her essay, Is Paris Burning, quote, "Livingston does not oppose the way hegemonic whiteness represents Blackness, but rather assumes an imperial overseeing position that is in no way progressive or counter-hegemonic." Despite the film's problematized legacy, as an extension to this analysis, Paris is Burning remains an important document and celebration of queer space and family making. Poet Essex Hempel lauded the film as an accomplishment, writing in a 1991 review for The Guardian, "Houses of silk and garbadine are built, houses of dream and fantasy, houses that bear the names of their legendary founders, houses rise and fall, legends come and go. To pose is to reach for power while simultaneously holding real powerlessness at bay." Thus, Hempel signifies that the houses of Black and brown queerness are too in the wake, again calling on Sharp. The act of posing within the ballroom culture is a spatial meditation of unsurvival that refuses the weaponization of queer bodies of color and allows bodies to take up space in taking on and serving new shapes and face. The claiming of a rangefulness that recognizes the embodiment of range as a privilege in its own right. Performance artist and scholar E. Patrick Johnson writes in his 2003 Appropriating Blackness, quote, "Banned from both the public spaces of the heterosexual Black home and the white gay clubs, Black gay men and women create private spaces, the nightclub, another gay person's house, a ball house, etc., to create community," unquote. The radical act of redefining home space and claiming nightlife as a site to experiment, explore, dream, and achieve makes plain the ecstatic elasticity of Black life looking to reformat, rebuild, restructure, and re-envision within a supremacist hegemonic milieu. As film critic Chaos and Collins reflects, quote, "For a queer minority of a certain age, who once longed to express yourself and your sexuality in ways you didn't yet understand, this film was an education. Paris is Burning brought legendary performers and ballroom icons Dorian Corey, Venus Extravaganza, Pepper LaBeija, and Willie Ninja, amongst others, into a heightened public visibility and reimagination, along with the vernacular of ballroom space. The language of Blackness, reading, shade, work, legendary, fierce, yes, queen, queer Blackness took the global stage at a monumental scale with Livingston's film. Introducing queer African-American vernacular English to a white and non-Black audience and paving the way for the plausibility of the internationally televised drag culture of the 2000s, as exemplified by RuPaul's Drag Race, which premiered in America in early 2009 and has since continued for 11 seasons. In further troubling and problematizing the transmission of Black queer culture from private house space to public home space, this is where we can depressingly, wryly think back to where we began. The car scene in White Chicks, to see what happens when a white audience claims or steps into a Black performance tradition in private. What happens when the queer Black house enters the straight non-Black home via the mimesis of digital material? The internet, while very much so still a house for many queer people of color as a site of community building and networked creative expression, has simultaneously provided a home to a non-Black audience who, within the safety of their heterogeneity, step out in their Insta comments and reposted memes, utilizing QAAVE, Queer African American Vernacular English, without any recognition nor understanding of where it comes from, the important history behind it, and how its transmission away from its site of origin follows in an imperialist colonial tradition. Internet and sound artist Keith Obadake of the conceptual duo Mendy and Keith Obadake expands on this, saying, Blackness represents some kind of borderless excess, some kind of unchecked expression, like the commonly confused notion that with African drumming or jazz, you just play whatever you want, whatever you feel, rather than develop structured content. I would argue that this same kind of romantic freedom is also associated with the net, so that Blackness and this kind of digital frontier become conflated. Artist and writer Manuel Arturo Abreu expands on this notion of Blackness as perceived by non-Black people to be, quote, borderless excess in their ever necessary essay, Online Imagined Black English, citing linguist Cecilia Cutler's theory that, quote, hip hop is increasingly claimed to be a multicultural lifestyle, unquote, suggesting that non-Black people can enter and exit as they please, trying Blackness on like a newfangled diet. Abreu calls out the phenomenon of non-Black English speakers with no fluency using real or imaginary linguistic features of Black English, which they call imagined Black English. The QAAVE of Paris is Burning, as an early driver of viral memetic queer Blackness, extends the non-Black fantasy that Cutler proposes and is further challenged by Abreu in their essay. Thus, queerness, and specifically Black and brown queerness, as embodied by the proliferation of QAAVE across the digital landscape, is increasingly claimed as a multicultural lifestyle. It's impossible to talk about this history and its complicated relationship with Black vernacular, speech, and movement alike without revisiting the first digital meme, the dancing baby, which you saw in the visual essay, also known problematically as Baby Cha-Cha. The man who is credited as being its primary creator is Michael Gerard, who in 1996 was running his own 3D animation company, Unreal Pictures in California. Gerard, along with a team of others, conceived of the idea originally as an experiment to test out the application of different types of data and files within an animation software called Character Studio, used along with a product called 3D Studio Max. As such, the original file for the dancing baby was called SK Baby Max. Both Character Studio and 3D Studio Max are products from a company called Autodesk, which many may use today, which is a multinational company that, founded in 1982, is best known for its AutoCAD design software. When the 3D source file as video animation was released to the public, users were able to create their own video clips of the original Dancing Baby and circulate these copies along digital forums. The file was shared as open source. People were able to download and distribute the Dancing Baby royalty-free. In late 1996, a web developer named John Woodall managed to create a highly compressed animated GIF from the original source video animation. Further compressed, the Dancing Baby very quickly proliferated, its virality becoming an international sensation that appeared both online and on broadcast TV. Gerard, in reflecting on this period of time, notes, "I think it spread because the file was a GIF you could attach easily to emails, and the baby seemed carefree and optimistic. But mostly, and kind of disturbingly, people enjoyed ridiculing it. I wanted my work to be taken seriously. I'd previously studied human motion with top choreographers. This baby was far less graceful and artistic. It was just a little uncanny valley GIF. As its popularity eclipsed our softwares, I got cynical. I didn't want to be associated with the animation, even though the exposure was great for my company." Outside of holding the title of being the first GIF, the Dancing Baby also appears to hold the position of being an early example of digital blackface, given the ethnic skin of the baby figure, and the fact that Baby Cha-Cha, though the name indicates otherwise, is not in fact doing the cha-cha at all. To provide some historical context, the basic footwork pattern of cha-cha-cha, 1, 2, 3, cha-cha, draws its influence from Afro-Cuban dances as found within the Santeria religion. These Afro-Cuban dances predate and carve out a pathway toward the ever-popular dance, the cha-cha. Thus, the cha-cha as a form of dance draws from an Afro-Latinx tradition. The naming of this baby as cha-cha underscores the creation of this figure, not rendered from life, as hailing from a white imagination of Black movement. Gerard's recognition that he had, quote, studied human motion with top choreographers makes plain the immense blind spot of cha-cha and how this racialized ethnic skin of the digital expands the viral transmission of the Dancing Baby through popular culture. Complicating things further along the lines of cultural appropriation, the video animation in the 1990s was subsequently set to the 1974 blue suede cover of the song Hooked on a Feeling, which you saw in the video essay again, but I'm reminding you here in the event that you would like to check it out on your own at some point. This was a cover of the English songwriter's Jonathan King's 1971 hit, which was an arrangement inspired by a 1971 recording by an all-Black Jamaican reggae band, the Twinkle Brothers. In the blue suede cover, one can hear a chanted Uga Chaka, which, in a deeply troubled gesture, performs a minstrelsy in perpetuating via this chanted speech a European fantasy of indigenous vernacular. In a bizarre twist, this Black baby, accompanied by the blue suede soundtrack, was featured on an episode of Ally McBeal titled Cro-Magnon, wherein the baby became a recurring hallucination of the show's white female protagonist. The baby, now bound to the song, thereafter became known as the Uga Chaka baby. The form of the Dancing Baby as it traveled expanded to include Samurai Baby and Rasta Baby, demonstrating that projecting racial fantasy on a child form was a primary driver in manifesting a minstrelsy for the exact public ridicule Gerard speaks of. To bring Laura Michelle Jackson's words back into the room, what is the half-life of a meme? What is the rate at which a good-natured meme decays into the grossest displays of public ridicule? It is useful to consider as part of this discussion as well the trope of what I call here Black American royalty as a key cog within an American memetic engine. The elevation of specific Black people to a position so far beyond a quotidian Blackness of a collective everyday troubles, fractures, disrupts what economist Glenn C. Lowry calls the Black prophetic tradition. One that historically has taken a strong anti-imperialist, anti-racist, and anti-militarist tilt. Memetic Blackness achieves this, as the consumption of Black images drives the imperialist, racist, militarist agendas embedded within a capitalist framework. With culture drunk on the imbibement of Black data, it is easy to get confused about who exactly is in control of these transmissioned images, even if we ourselves are creating them, problematizing further the authorship and transfer of Black material within a country and culture steeped in anti-Blackness. The brilliant Morgan Parker writes in her poem, Beyonce Celebrates Black History Month, I have almost forgotten my roots are not long blonde. I have almost forgotten what it means to be at sea. To be at sea brings us back to the Middle Passage, that compressed collectivity of our Black data held in the wake. Parker here imagines an interior monologue of Queen Bay, a reminder of the violence of forgetting found in the forced distance between a projected exterior performative image through a Eurocentric lens, this long and blonde, and the roots of an early Black becoming. Still, even with these tensions of interiority and exteriority, there are indisputably two royal houses in this America, the House of Bay and the House of Obama. Peering through this lens, Beyonce's music video Formation, released in February 2016, is nothing short of wild and at many points triggering. Zandria F. Robinson notes, Formation offers up New Orleans as a convergence place for a Blackness that slays through dreams, work, ownership, legacy, and the audacity of bodies that dare move and live in the face of death. As an actual and imagined site of Black Southern ecstasy, tragedy, remembrance, and revolutionary possibility, NOLA is the pendulum on which Beyonce rides a Southern genealogy that traverses the Deep South from Alabama to Louisiana to Texas, back and through with stops in between. Yet, Formation puts on, performs this slay first and foremost through the skin of a queer Blackness, perpetuating a tangle of QAAVE memetic minstrelsy and necropolitic, despite the material itself being shaped by the hand of a Black woman. In the video, right before we see Beyonce positioned on a throne of a submerged police vehicle in a post-Katrina NOLA, we hear the voice of the late genderqueer musical artist and YouTube star Messi Maya, asking, what happened at the New Wilden? Maya was murdered in New Orleans in 2010 at the age of 22. The sample comes from a YouTube video featuring Maya titled Booking the Hose from New Wilden, which today has been viewed on YouTube more than 3 million times. In 2017, Beyonce and Maya's presence in Formation came under scrutiny when Maya's sister and sole heir filed a $20 million lawsuit in New Orleans federal court, claiming the pop star's Formation and Lemonade music videos used the voice of the late New Orleans bounce rapper Messi Maya without consent from Maya's estate. This act of appropriation in the context of Queen Bay's Formation demonstrates that the co-opting of Black queerness as part of a viral Black visuality on behalf of Black cultural icons is far from naive. Strategic, it enriches royal texts like this one with sonic vernacular citations and cultural footnotes that travel far from their original owners, drawing queer Black labor into a complicated economy without compensation or credit. To call again on Parker's poetics, this is a true forgetting. Beyonce's use of a post-Katrina New Orleans as the backdrop for Formation also remains in question as we consider a memetic Blackness and how its fetishism can toe the pornographic in the racial American imaginary. New Orleans native Chantrell Lewis wrote in 2016 for Slate, while some are made giddy by the metaphor of Beyonce's body being subsumed by the water, I am remembering images of bloated bodies of grandmothers and grandfathers, cousins, uncles, great aunts, and nieces that drifted through the floodwaters like discarded pieces of scrap wood. These were all images that ran across my television screen on repeat in the weeks and months after the levees broke. These were the horrifying tales relayed to me by survivors of the storm. Conversely, this is a Snapchat video recorded by Usher the evening of Obama's hosting of BET Presents Love and Happiness and Obama Celebration in October of 2016. And it presents a different take on Black image making, production, and collective authorship. The celebration, taking place in the final months of the Obamas in the White House, was described as a love letter to President Obama and the First Lady, Michelle Obama. Usher's Snapchat featured himself, Janelle Monáe, and the president dancing to Drake's Hotline Bling, a complex moment that recognizes with a deeply meta sense of self-awareness a Black royal flex. The video itself, as it extends and travels through memetic Blackness, is also a unique moment of Black self-portraiture, a self-determined document that makes visible superficially the close networks of Black celebrity infecting the Obama family while simultaneously carrying the subtext of a deliberate trace-making and public utterance, ephemera to be left behind and transmitted as a reminder of an unparalleled moment of a very Black presence in a very white house. To close here, it is imperative, necessary, urgent that we recognize that the presence of memetic Blackness predates the internet. These moments across history cited here and that we are living in today have made possible what we understand as the Black meme, complicating it as a cultural material. The use of Black imagery is not neutral. The presence of Blackness and the transmission of it as extension needs to be more than an aesthetic act and should not be decorative within the digital. The history that precedes the event of the internet is important to recognize and unpack it as a precursor, bettering our understanding of the resonance of the birth of a digital nation and the ways wherein we may be complicit. Gwendolyn Brooks wrote in her 1979 poem, Computer, which I love and adore, "I conduct a computer does not conduct me." Brooks here with these words reminds us all that transmission requires an operator. Behind all of these screens, it's just you and me. Thank you.
Legacy, I guess you're ready for questions?
Yeah, I'm open to people's questions, thoughts about this moment. Yeah.
And yeah, Legacy, a comment someone said on Facebook, Chanel Gidrea said, "Legacy, you are brilliant. I really want my house to see this, especially the section about ballroom."
I mean, I think it's like just important. Thank you for that comment. I think it's just important that, we keep surfacing these things. They seem to surface and then at points, kind of fall back into the broader chaos that is visual culture right now. But, is incredibly necessary that we're kind of constantly interrogating how these materials are being used and quite literally thefted, and as well taking time and care to, look at the broader arc of history and how these things are being contextualized.
Chris, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was curious. I mean, this is kind of this might be an in the weeds question, but I was really interested in how, your conversation both, one of the theses, as you said, is that Black mimesis predates the internet. And I'm curious about how the media circulation of Black mimetic qualities in a largely sort of decentralized and democratized internet space. How, I guess, I'm wondering, would you suggest that there needs to be some kind of centralized structure in place to kind of regulate the circulation of Blackness online, or would you suggest that there be a kind of individual internal structure of kind of psychological and moral self-governance for that kind of exists within each user of the internet?
I would say both, and I kind of feel strongly about both. We'll go out, out on a limb to be controversial perhaps, but I think it's a bit more than a moral reckoning, in that aspects of how Black gesture is currently being kind of mined and circulated is really complicated, and there have been ongoing discussions of the legality of what that looks like, right? As people are kind of rising to different levels of fame on different platforms like TikTok and YouTube, et cetera. people ask them questions about literally how to like copyright a gesture as they see those things traveling away from themselves. And it's really complicated too, because you see, you know, the amount of people I think who are kind of becoming quote unquote famous, right? They like literally have such a presence and a following simply because of how they're moving, and then people copying those movements in their own physical form and or sharing the documentary sort of footage of that out in the world as documentation is a huge legal question, and one that requires, I think, further examination in terms of what precedent needs to be set to compensate people for that work. And when we look at, you know, platforms like Vine, right, which no longer exist, but these were archives of Black movement and continue to be, you know, sort of the material that dictates these other platforms as we use them today, so Snapchat and TikTok, what have you. So obviously, I appreciate the sort of moral and ethical quandaries that are presented within this. And I think it's really useful to interrogate, like, why is it that we need to express ourselves through the use of other types of Black movement, queer movement gesture, and, you know, how that operates, how one can do it responsibly and with care, and as well, like, understanding the histories. But then I think as well, like, zooming out further, like borrowing from these histories, actually, as we look at how, you know, the history of Black music has operated within, you know, an American context, and as well sampling, right? That like royalties, the language of sampling, how that has, you know, had an adverse impact on Black Americans is quite frankly devastating. And when we talk about, you know, a history of reparations, right, and what the need is to have reparations be part of our current discourse, it is about, you know, the project of slavery, how it has driven our current structures of capitalism, but also as well, it's thinking very sensitively too about everything along the way that has essentially thefted from Black and brown people, and asking questions about ways where that can be compensated differently. So, you know, gesture is that now, you know, and there obviously are, you know, parts of this that travel along the lines of music and sound, you know, and as well language. But I think it's incredibly important too to imagine, right, what would a reparations look like if we were to think about what it means to compensate people for their movement, quite literally. I'm looking at, you know, I see a question from E. Jane. Hi, E. It's nice to see you here. Yeah, I mean, I think reality TV is something that I guess I'll answer two of these questions kind of like at once. One is this question of like the birth of this research, like where did it come from and why? You know, my background largely looks at the intersection of Blackness, queerness, and visual culture, specifically mapping to digital culture and the internet. So my first book that comes out in the fall, in September, is one that explores that through the lens of kind of a histories of cyberfeminism and performance, you know, as it ties to artists who are making within the contemporary art realm right here and now. And so this body of research is one that has begun over the course of this past year and a half. It's been something that has been a folder and a kind of like think space in a, you know, in terms of just like articles and things that I've been reading and thinking about actively as I've been writing Glitch Feminism, which is my first book, because I do think that these questions of race and gender, where those things come into contact, required their own space. And so there, you know, as I was writing my first book, was thinking through the ways where that could be better addressed, especially given that oftentimes discussions of digital culture focus so fully on what is happening on the screen here and now, and in reality often forget the like broader infrastructure or architectural questions, which are like incredibly problematic, that precede the internet, but then have dictated how we are using this material right here and now. So, you know, when we think about reality TV, it's been an interesting thing because I did not grow up with a television, but, you know, so I think that I often kind of laugh because I grew up in a very kind of granola household where we had very little junk food and no TV. And as a result, as an adult, love all things visual, and as well, like, you know, we'll love all things that's tied to kind of the kind of consumption of material and studying it as text. But I also think very much so that, you know, this is an opportunity to think through how these things can be studied further and unpacked with slowness and care.
So a viewer, Darla, mentioned you kind of referred to this already, but about institutions, meme reparation, and capitalist recuperation. Could you state that last part that you said?
Hi, yeah, thank you so much, Legacy. I really appreciate the wide range of your genealogy of Black meme. And I've, as you know, had the privilege of beginning to read your book, Glitch Feminism, a Manifesto. I really appreciate the work that you've been doing. I want to ask a question about temporality, the temporality of the meme, the Black meme, and the temporality of institutions. And the reason for that is because I want to think about reparations and the strategies of reparations. So a certain kind of capitalist recuperation is happening right now in terms of institutions posting their statements about more closely attending to Black death, and the ways that institutions need to move and address reparations is on my mind in terms of how the Black meme is taken up through the attempt on, let's say, on Instagram in particular, through the attempt to move forward, both in terms of market strategy going forward for institutions, as well as a certain attempt to, I think, genuinely attend to the ways that institutions need to account for their role in white supremacy. So I wonder if you could help us think about the temporality of the meme, of the Black meme, and then the temporality of institutions, which I take to be much slower than the meme.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like these questions of circulation are obviously ones that I'm seeing a question in the chat about Black Lives Matter, right? I think it's like really important in this moment to be spending some time thinking about what circulation in this moment means, institutionally and otherwise, given that there is, I think, an incredibly vast amount of sort of virtue signaling that is taking place that, you know, is complicated and concerning at points because it doesn't always map to sort of real and concrete strategies towards change or liberation. And, you know, I have been personally, I think, very concerned at points to see how much that's happening, and also kind of like who's doing that and who is not. I still, to this moment, have been, you know, sort of darkly amused by the fact that all of these student loan companies have said zero things during this period of time in terms of support of Black Lives Matter, which for me, if we're thinking about, you know, demands towards a kind of thought process, infrastructure, institution of reparations, what that could be. Student loan companies should be part of that discussion, but it's really interesting to see, like, there are no banners, there's no signifying happening from those places and spaces. So, you know, I do think that, like, these questions about institutions and like the speed of the meme and then the speed of the institution, it, like, you know, is challenging at points to have those discussions, because I do think that institutions, by the sheer pace of that movement, maybe is not best suited for some of what is happening in terms of a dialogue and discourse right now, right? Because so many things are traveling so quickly. But I also think that institutions have an opportunity to encourage a certain type of slowness purely through their own bureaucracy, right? Which is, like, at points can be complicated and problematic, but I think that slowness in a moment like this feels urgent and necessary, and at points taking time to encourage institutional spaces to not move quickly, but to move with care, and to be deliberate in how they are doing political work, and making resolutions towards doing that, you know, being conscious of what those steps are. That feels to me like the thing to focus on, and that I would love to see more of. So, you know, I'm seeing now, I guess, to continue to be responsive to what's happening in the questions, because I think this is a through line, right? If we're thinking about the institutional response to Black Lives Matter, the kind of challenge to this moment in time to do better, really, because that is, like, you know, the bare minimum of what is being asked, right? To kind of acknowledge the value of a Black life and to integrate that meaningfully into how we are engaging with systems of care institutionally. You know, this question about the memification of Breonna Taylor is one that I've been thinking about deeply. Because I think it's an example of where some of these things trip up. very much so in recognizing that I think the intention or kind of figuring out a way to make visible the death of Breonna Taylor, and her murder, right? Asking questions about, how to do that responsibly, but also to not gamify it. And, I was really worried in the very beginnings of some of these discussions because of the fact that people were, quite quick to, be witty within the context of the kind of fast moving viral space, but have quite literally gamified the death of a Black woman by, creating new forms of visual culture that are being, rapidly disseminated, making use of this young woman's life and her death as a means of creating images. So there are ones with, Make America Great Again. There are, with Breonna Taylor's name in it. There are ones with Jeopardy and, the letters of her name being spelled out. And that in itself, I think, we're seeing it circulated, by Black people and people of color. So that for me, I think has been a really complicated thing to see, but also I think is a reminder too that interrogation needs to be one that is rhizomatic and holistic. It requires, I think, a mindfulness on the part of Black and non-Black people to think through the ways we are using Black life and death towards strategic means, and what that can do in kind of working toward and against the violence of institutional spaces.
Legacy, you mentioned circulation, and I've been kind of doing research on like the history of video art and film, basically. But it's interesting because this book I'm reading by Erica Balsam, she mentions that, before in early video, it was kind of about copy, like the idea of the copy, and artists kind of like making work about that. And now, like more currently, it's become about this idea of circulation and consumption, and also how it's distributed. So I'm kind of wondering how do we address like ethics for like resharing or like for meme culture without being too like, I guess, like dogmatic in a way. Like, yeah, I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
I have lots of unresolved thoughts about it, but maybe like a one way of approaching it is through the example of what someone thoughtfully put into the chat of the lens of political memes, and this idea of, ways where things can be used to make us look closer and to engage more critically in the act of kind of readership of visual culture, of politics, of gender, of race, and like doing that work in a way that advances towards the breaking of certain structures. I think that like we've seen obviously that there are many things that exist along political lines on both sides that people are both laughing and crying at, because obviously meme culture lends itself to some of that in terms of the kind of comedic timing of it, and as well like really zeroing in right on certain types of gestures during political speeches, the presence of what folks are wearing and like, kind of what's happening in the background. So all of these things, I think, I've found to be meaningful in terms of an analysis of culture. So, I think it's about recognizing that this question of like of circulation needs to run alongside of the kinds of navigation of the kind of sort of ethical and moral compass as tied to the issue of use, really. And so, I don't think that, in this moment in time, and perhaps with change, I'm not necessarily saying that like memes as a thing, right, are something that needs to end per se, right? But I'm actually asking questions about what memes are used, how, when, where, and why, and across which histories. And I do think that like when we ask questions about some of these things as tied to their structure, right, like memes and GIFs in particular could not exist without things like the kind of cinematic kind of sort of language as established in early cinema, like that is quite problematic, like Birth of a Nation. So some of these strategies that have been used to shape and edit, quite literally, visual culture, we're seeing deployed in the same ways within these sort of snippets that travel very quickly. So part of it is about reading the image, right, and seeing obviously what's within the frame, as one would do with a painting per se, right? Like literally, how do you break it down and kind of read it thoroughly and with care? But then also asking questions too about what techniques are being kind of deployed to help us do that looking, and or what is being edited out, and two, who is or is not being compensated within this. And I do think that there is, a real deep and deeply embedded issue of class within some of these conversations about people who, are essentially made celebrity. They kind of rise out of very little in terms of their socioeconomic powers, and, within a kind of capitalist system, are made celebrities, and then, are basically compensated in terms of their visibility, but actually still are left with no actual real investment in terms of a sustainable future, and or being able to build a life for themselves, that allows for some sort of economic security. So I feel like that it is not as simple perhaps as just analyzing it through the lens of a circulation alone, but that actually it's breaking it down, I think, in terms of the broader striations, and class is a big component of that too, which feels meaningful.
Yeah, we did actually a year ago, we did a talk with a couple of meme creators, and it was interesting to, there was that conversation of like, are memes art, or how can we like read memes? And I totally echo what you're saying. Like, it needs to become more about the reading of the image, really.
Absolutely. And I'm seeing a question in the chat about kind of demanding credit. It's complicated. Like, I feel like there have been examples of folks, I can use Arthur Jafa, right? Because Arthur Jafa is doing this, sort of series of screenings over the course of the last 48 hours. And this is an example of like, a borrowing, right, that has come out of a certain type of collaboration, right, that is borrowing from visual culture, and then as well is paying credit to those things, but as well encouraging the circulation of it as kind of part of its methodology. I think that as a space and place to occupy is very different than, a situation where, we are seeing different types of sort of theft that is coming as a kind of deliberate sort of strategy of opacity, in recognizing that, if in taking something, that this is a kind of navigation of a power dynamic, really, right? And institutionally and otherwise, right? When we see not only at an individual level that happening, but it happening at a broader scale. And also too, within the space and kind of form of digital culture, where often it's really difficult to kind of figure out where some of these things begin and end, simply because of the sheer speed and accelerationism of it. That in itself, I think, is something that requires, further examination. And I do feel like a big problem of it, is this question of a kind of precedent, asking questions too of like this complicated language of intellectual property, which extends to gesture, when people often are trying to trademark and copyright certain things, that after, all of these years, and as we discuss these things, we can see that aspects of this legal precedence in terms of property and that language in and of itself, right, is tied to the project of slavery, and two, is something that is complicated further by, the legacy of, a Black ownership, right, quite literally, of our bodies. So, I do think that like part of the things that, needs to be kind of further interrogated too, is taking time to think through how aspects of these structures can be navigated differently, but as well, artists taking time and care to spend some time understanding the legal implications of some of these things and how they work toward or against the building of a kind of creative capital. I see a comment about seeing things in random places, I suppose, which is I guess kind of what I was alluding to previously, right? Is that like, how do you trace things that like actually are rendered without an origin, quote unquote? But I also do think that aspects of that are incredibly coercive. And, there have been some, incredible kind of detective work that's been done across people who are very invested in the kind of movement of images to see how things are kind of tracing to certain places and spaces. And so part of the reason why this research is really interesting to me, and still in its early stages, but very much so something that I will be continuing toward as I work towards my next book, and think further on it, is trying to understand better too, like why we are not spending more time asking about those origin sites and better kind of understanding our relationships to the individuals who are these quote unquote content creators. And we're seeing this happen, at such a rapid pace too. And like also, it's deeply problematic that we are often seeing, cisgendered white producers who are operating through these networks who are highly compensated for their work, their gestures, their words, the kind of material that they're producing. And actually, as a parallel to that, you are seeing folks who are Black people and brown people, queer people, who often are not able to quite get the same type of footing. And so that in itself, I think, as an economic question and kind of challenge, feels like something that is worth examining further. And as well, I think is something that drives further this question of figuring out ways to kind of question what futurity, survival, and as well reparations could even mean in thinking kind of backwards and forwards as we further interrogate these different structures. I'm seeing, a question that says, are the mechanics of the theft of Black art different in the meme versus music and sound? I mean, personally, as I have spent more time, in this research, I feel like more and more the answer to that would be no. And actually, we just don't have enough distance from this very present moment where GIFs as we know them right now and sort of memetic material as we know it right now, are proliferating and kind of being built. I would say that there are some very troubling parallels between this question of music sound, how that has been borrowed and not compensated for. And, really it comes down to the language of the royalty. And, as well, the questions too of how those things are being delineated across a broader economy. So, I feel at points very cynical about that, I will admit, because I can see very much so that how this conversation continues to unfold, right, often does, as I had mentioned previously, sort of leave open to some very monumental disparities across race, class, and gender. And that very much echoes a kind of broader history of what cultural production has been in America, which leaves often Black people at a place that is of high risk, high vulnerability in terms of having their cultural capital borrowed and then removed from them forcibly or otherwise. Yeah, Joey said techno. Yes, absolutely. Techno is a great example of some of that. I'm looking at the final question. Do you think the exercise of extracting Blackness from Black people of the meme of whiteness misunderstanding Black memes? I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, I suppose, because I don't quite fully understand the question.
Hi, my name's Levan. Thank you for your presentation. I think I was going to ask, do you think, I think because you brought up Arthur Hoffa, he talks about, or he has this quote that I think about, and I've thought about it when your video of showing Get Out when Daniel Kaluuya's character is falling, Black people make culture in free fall, and so for me, I feel like, I feel like that's what you're getting at. The meme is Blackness. Blackness is the meme, and so this kind of there's this I think large misunderstanding of memes because they are Black culture, and that happens for me. There's a lot of even what are considered white memes are these what we see as the white people's misunderstanding of a meme, and then they become memeified in that way. And so I guess for me is seeing the memes as sort of the refusal already, and or Black people's culture refusal. So I guess for me, and what is the process of like trying to get money off of that? I feel like it's like sort of like, or it's like more, I don't know what I'm trying to ask, but like the context of like saying that there is like the solution would be to like give people a sort of reparations. I think at first we'd have to like break that, like it starts with like the whole structure of this whole system and not just starting with memes, I guess.
Yes, I would agree. But I think, this is why I think it's complicated because, again, there was a point in time in a historical moment where people were saying this exact same thing about music. And so like aspects of this in terms of how we are considering these histories quite literally repeating themselves and then doing a sort of imitation of the same violence on Black and brown people, right? For me, I think is something that is all bound up and entangled in this question of reparations, ways too where people can be compensated differently for their work. And I think the thing that is like, similar to with these questions of what it is like historically to have royalties paid or not paid, samples taken without kind of credit or compensation, right? And this is for years at a time, right? Like going over decades and decades. Is that
yes.
like, aspects of how that has been monetized? It has literally allowed for a history of generational wealth, which is built on the backs of Black people, to advance itself and to allow for sort of power disparities to deepen, and as well socioeconomic disparities to deepen solely because of the fact that, at that genesis point, some work was not done, right? Like given these broader systems of supremacy, right? To protect the individuals who are the original creators. So, for me, I think that like asking questions about the meme, I agree with you, right? It is not supposed to be necessarily a shallow read, right? Where if we resolve memes, we resolve culture, right? But rather that actually looking at the history of the meme is not something that ties itself solely to a digital space, that how we are existing in the digital is something that is dictated by a history of supremacy that extends far before this current moment in time, yet is absolutely dictating how we are processing and engaging with images right now and making a spectacle too of Black death and social death via viral material, which is happening right here. We are living it, right? And then as well, like asking too how aspects of the structures that currently exist that are these kinds of quiet, insidious structures, right? The legalities of these things as we examine how they work, right? Like we have a system now that acknowledges more, in a greater complexity how royalties can work as tied to other types of creative craft and cultural production. I do think that, we've been seeing too people who are trying to figure out a way to navigate the use of their words and gestures. And these are Black people who are part of memes, whether they choose to be or not. And oftentimes, these are, materials that are being made in documenting people, and then as well people at points trying to make a living from this material that actually even they were not the original authors of. So
yeah.
Aspects of this too is like, it's highly perverse, I would say, and very meta, and it's confusing. I think like, part of the project of capitalism too is confusion, right? Is that it actually creates a level of opacity that in itself becomes a violence, and we don't know where to direct aspects of our activism, our kind of engagement, our attention, and actually through that become deeply exhausted. So, for me, talking about memes and memetic material feels like an opportunity to try to consider differently, what work and acts of care we can be putting into place now, and as well recognizing that like our gesture and movement, our expression, right, has value, and that it is not value to be consumed by a non-Black audience exclusively, right, but rather that we should be asking questions about how we value ourselves, and as well figuring out strategically as a part of collective discussion how those things can be treated differently in setting a precedent for our future.
Thank you for that.
Yesterday I watched this live with Patia's Fantasy World with Mark Jacobs, and it was actually really like thought-provoking to see that happen. But also they're a meme creator, I believe, and they have this giant anti-racism database on their page, and it's really, really good.
Yeah, and so this is what I'm saying is I think that there are different like channels within this, and like one thing is that memes have become part of our political discourse, and it's a way that we are giving feedback, through culture and politics and the world, and that's necessary. It's like just happening in a different form, right? So we can essay about it, we can create memes about it, we can have on and offline kind of forum about it in terms of thinking about this moment in the world, right? But I do think that like cultural feedback is sometimes noise. And I think too that like how we ourselves are being used to advance certain types of strategies in terms of visibility without an actual fair and real representation is very violent. So, I have felt too, right? I think that like we learn through memes. It's become part of how we at points will educate ourselves. We will see, differently as well, engaging in questions of economy, race, gender, class. Those are things that actually are very much deeply embedded into, how these different materials circulate. But I do recognize as well that it's about, the kind of root material, how these things travel as kind of a strategy in and of itself, and how they're structured. And then, most finally, too, how they're compensated, which is a question that I think, requires further examination, but is one that I'm hoping, right, as people can continue to kind of navigate that they can do it differently, and that as well, that, as part of the kind of ongoing discussion, that can be something that is centered more often.
Does it feel like a good time to wrap up?
Yes, thank you all.
Thank you so
much.
much.
What an incredible discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Legacy, and thank you to everybody who had the courage to ask questions, both in the chat and on video too. Really appreciate you.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And for the question about resources, happy to continue that conversation if you guys want to reach out to me via email or social media.
Yeah, what's your handle?
At L Russell, I'll put it in the chat. And at Legacy Russell is on Twitter. Yeah.
And then your Need book comes out?
It comes out this September 29th. And yeah, you guys can find information about it online. But I'll share the link in the chat as well for those who would like to check it out.
Thank you guys so much. Emma, do you want to lead us out?
Yeah, I'll just dance us out. Thank you again, Chris, Joey, and especially Legacy for having this conversation with us today. So thank you so much, Legacy, and thank you for everybody who stuck around with us a little bit longer. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, guys.
Bye, guys.